Again, everyone. I'm Jessica Smith with City, and I am pleased to welcome you to our social drop-in with Minnie Bredouw. Minnie is the Executive Director of Purpose Project, a nonprofit founded at IDEO, a global innovation firm. She also runs her own business, Studio Bredouw, focused solely on designing for equity and inclusion. She has spent most of her career designing programs focused on inclusion, equity, and education reform. She is also an educator, teaching classes on inclusion and design for social impact at the graduate level. Minnie has been with us for the past 2 days, and we are happy to have her this morning for some question and answer. And Brenda Johansson will be the interviewer for the day. So I will first let Brenda introduce herself, and then Minnie, you can go into your introductions.
Sure. Hi, thank you for having me. Thanks, Jess, and thanks, Minnie, for being here. My name is Brenda Johansson, and I serve as the Research and Data Manager for the City team here at UW-Whitewater. But I also have a couple different hats as a former educator and a former foster parent, and also an advocate within the community. So I'm hoping today that as we talk with Minnie about a couple different topics, we can turn the focus to some more community levels of inclusion.
Great. And it's great to be here. First off, how is my connection doing? Better? Great. Yeah, I'm Minnie. I was keynote on Wednesday. I've done a workshop both with the faculty and students at UW-Whitewater, and I'm just happy to be here and participate in such an important piece of work, an important event in thinking about how we can create kind of a more inclusive mindset at scale, and how we can use design and innovation to kind of inspire that process. So I'm ready to chat and see where we can go with this conversation.
Well, I know Jess is monitoring the chat, but I thought, as I've been listening to you for the last 2 days, Minnie, I've really been struck by the elegance and the simplicity of all these processes that you've talked through. And I think that we have a lot of good models for how larger institutions and kind of established organizations can use it. But one of my passions is just volunteering in the community, and organizations, clubs, all those little tiny nonprofits and activity groups that are so vital when you move into smaller towns and rural areas. And those are the pieces that often are the first step of inclusion for anybody with disabilities, from children into adults who are, trying to make an impact and be a part of their community. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, what you've seen there, and if you've had any presence with those kind of organizations.
Yeah, definitely. Happy to do it. And notably, I run a nonprofit, so I'm very comfortable, and I think it's important that we think about inclusion and equity in the context of kind of how we show up every day as individual contributors, as small organizations, as large organizations, as NGOs and so forth. So a couple ways that I think about adapting this mindset and these processes for smaller companies or early stage, nonprofits or community-based organizations is, I think, first and foremost, really doing our homework. One of the things I talked about yesterday is the importance of understanding trauma, developing a muscle and a lens around trauma and trauma-informed care, and starting to sort of build a larger sort of Rolodex of understanding what that looks like, and really being kind of conscious and thoughtful about the importance of looking at intersectionality and what kind of historic trauma might be experienced by different communities. And I think it can be easy to, I use this term, pathological altruism, where you think you're looking to do good or do better, but actually it's quite important that we take a step back before we try to, especially if you're new to working with a community or new to a new sort of topic and you're looking to volunteer with or kind of grow your muscles around. And so I think that's foundational in all the work that anyone's doing, no matter what community you're part of, whether you're part of a education, education group, or whether you work within a nonprofit, we always have more to learn. And so I think acknowledging that is a starting point. Beyond that, I think there's also a lot of value in creating processes where power is not tipped toward the individual who is the volunteer or who's coming in to try to support or help and may not have that lived experience, but actually where the tools that we're designing for supporting and helping in an authentic way is co-creative and collaborative. And we're acknowledging that every individual is bringing an incredible set of skills. And those are two things that I think have really kind of helped reshape the work around kind of systematizing design for inclusion in my practice. And again, happy to share more, but those are two sort of foundational things that I encourage all of my students to think about before stepping foot inside a new opportunity to sort of volunteer or support in a new way.
I think one of the things that has struck me as I've helped kids that are involved in juvenile justice or young adults that are in the foster care system is there's, especially for small organizations, there's kind of a trap that I call they just have to ask trap, where it's a small organization, they've set up some initial processes, and they want to be inclusive. They want to allow and to support everyone, but because getting started is hard, and thinking through all of that, who might be using your services can be really difficult. They'll say, well, I've set it up this way, and if anybody else needs anything else, they just have to ask. And I feel like that can often create a barrier. Can you talk a little bit about how to move away from we'll do that if they ask, to a welcome, getting that foot in the door and feeling welcome at the start?
Yeah, that's an interesting framing and a really good challenge to articulate. Yeah, I think that one of the things that when we look at like the practice of co-design, which is what I use in my own process of working with youth, I exclusively work with youth and young adults on a range of social impact challenges. And one of the things I always try to instill with the young people I'm working with is how much I am learning from the community that I'm a part of at that moment. And when you're running or facilitating a workshop or something along those lines, I remember in my early days, like kids would be like, all right, teacher, what's up? They would always kind of joke that like, I'm kind of was the one standing in front or facilitating. And what I realized over the many years of working in this space was how important it is to know that I'm actually the student. I'm the one that's entering a new space, and I may have a set of skills around design. I might have a set of skills around facilitation. But at the end of the day, the most important thing that I can do is actually learn and be a student, and not a student in the sense that I'm saying, you need to tell me about what you're experiencing, or I'm not going to be able to make something of value. Like that's not a good, space to play either, where you put people on the spot. But in fact, to actually just simply say, what I, want to do is kind of open up new channels and avenues for you to find your creative voice and for you to find an opportunity to really express yourself and realize that every person is creative. Every person has ideas. And so to answer your exact question, rather than saying, I'm expecting someone to ask for exactly what they need, there's a lot of learned experiences that especially young people from backgrounds, historically disadvantaged backgrounds, they may have learned like asking's not going to help me, right? I asked before and I didn't get it, so why ask again? And so instead to really say like, let's work on problem solving, and let's sort of think about how we can be creative together and find new channels and avenues to really give people agency over what it is that they think should be created, what they think that their community needs. I always want to say like it's about putting you in a position of power. It's not about me like translating your needs. It's about you feeling ownership and advocacy to advocate for what you need. And if I don't set that up properly, then I'm not doing my job, in fact. So I hope that helps kind of think a little bit about that challenge that you shared.
It does. Yeah, it kind of brings up a new question of that, handing over power can also be really difficult, especially if you have that that level of altruism that you've been talking about. And if you're, somebody who really is out there trying to do good and trying to help, it can be really difficult to, turn that lens on yourself and say, how am I changing that, and what am I doing to make sure that I'm supporting rather than inflicting or imposing on. So do you have any tips for people who really do have that level of altruism, but that level of self-reflection can be a hard first step?
Yeah, I also recommend a friend of mine and someone who practices in a similar space. His name is George and he wrote a really great article. I think, in fact, I quoted him yesterday in one of my workshops, where he talks about designers and the role of power. And again, when I say the word design, I just mean anybody who's problem solving, anybody who's problem solving in a creative way. And we're inherently given power. It's just the same way, you're born into a certain skin color and you're given power. You're born a certain gender and you're given power. You're born into a certain background or family or socioeconomic status and you're given power. And by sheer default of having the capacity and ability to kind of go into a community and support, you're given power. And so the very first step, as with any social structure, is to recognize that power and to understand that privilege, and to realize, as someone who is able to have the capacity to think about what social impact looks like and at systems and at scale, can be an opportunity that many people are not afforded. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy, I wouldn't be doing this work if I was looking to figure out where my next meal was coming from. That would be my priority, right? And so, so there's a lot of great tools, and I'm sure, increasingly it's encouraging to see that folks are reading about how to practice allyship better and how to be thinking more consciously about sort of what it means to acknowledge power. And I think with regards to how do we actually then think about helping or supporting, if, I think there's this, what we see for a lot of white folks in the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, is then there's a fear, I'm going to mess up, so I don't even want to try. I don't want to help because I'm not sure what to do, and I'm going to mess up and I'm going to get yelled at. Yeah. And ultimately, we have to acknowledge that it's our job to be facilitators, and then to point, as in, for example, in the Black Lives Matter movement, as a white person trying to practice allyship, it's our job to guide people in our circles and communities to voices of color and to people who are thought leaders and experts. It's not our job to take credit. It's not our job to be owners of that space. It's our job to get into white spaces that otherwise someone from the Black community might not be able to, and then to say this is the person who's kind of leading this charge, and I'm going to take a step back. And I think the most important thing we can do, in a similar metaphor with designing for social impact, is actually just play the part you need to play, and then know when your exit is. It's a term I think a lot about in improv, this framework, enter when needed. And I often think, how can I enter when needed and also exit when needed? And so I'm getting a little long-winded in this answer, but it's a complex topic, so I want to make sure I do it justice. And so what I try to do in that scenario is actually set people up to take the problem space over once I leave. And I just see myself as an educator, and I just see myself as somebody who's there to teach a process and a skill set. A lot of kids don't grow up thinking they're creative. A lot of young people, don't have someone telling them that they have a lot of strengths already embedded within them. So it's my job to basically say, you have this skill, let me work with you and the group that I'm working with to build that muscle, that creative muscle. And then once there's a comfort, and once there's, like I said in a talk yesterday, I think bringing in near peers are some of the best facilitators. If I can work with the community partner to see, are there people who've gone through and experienced this work, or the same experience as the group we're working with, and have them effectively take over, and sort of step away and, hope that what I've been able to contribute is a catalyst for something, but I'm not the one that should be getting the credit for it.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic answer. And I think that really, speaks to that fear. I see that a lot. I mean, I live in the Midwest, in a suburban / rural, not a super diverse area, and that the level of good intentions, but that level of hesitancy, because, no one wants, people have good intentions and they want to help, but no one wants to feel like they're going to do more harm than good. And I really like that ability to enter, but also that time to leave. Thank you. I think Jess had a question, so I'm going to let her hop in for a moment.
Thank you. This is such a stimulating conversation, and it brings out the social worker in me and some curiosity that I'm wondering if any students that are watching might be thinking about Minnie in terms of from my discipline and training, and sometimes my colleagues in special education and rehabilitation counseling and psychology. There's many courses and experiences and these foundations of this social justice conversation that we're having. And I'm fairly naive and ignorant around the designer educational experience. And so I'm curious about your background and how you've pulled together this perspective, because it strikes me as such an approachable, meaningful, human framing to engage in the conversation, and as Brenda was just restating, knowing when to exit, and it seems like it's a very that the sharing of the power isn't maybe as it doesn't strike me as feeling so uncomfortable or contentious as maybe sometimes it is in kind of pop culture. And so I'm just wondering if you could kind of take us on your educational journey and maybe how you learned to frame your design work in this way.
Yeah, that's such a good question too, because I don't even know the answer some days. How did I get here? But I'll happily share kind of what that very nonlinear path has looked like for me, and also some pitfalls I think that the design and innovation community has to be cautious about, because we are one set of problem solvers, but we don't sort of own this creative problem solving space. And I think it's important that we also recognize our limitations too, and what we're investing our time in. So my particular journey was really sort of began with just the two things that as a young person that I had always kind of spent my time on when I wasn't in the academic, just doing my classes at school, were art or whatever creative problem I could get my hands on. I would build board games or, submit stuff to the egg drop competition. I really liked these ways of kind of coming up with new ideas. And the other thing was volunteering, and mostly with youth and young people. And granted, I'm a young person myself, but I was a teen tutor, and I loved kind of working with middle schoolers. In high school, I coached Girls on the Run, which is a program focused on helping young women sort of build self-esteem and body confidence, and continued to do that through college. And so I was always trying to find this intersection of creativity and social impact, and kind of where they came together. I was like, maybe I'll be an art teacher. I don't know. And I mean, to some extent, I sort of do that on another level. But yeah, so I went to school for design, and I remember that the iPhone hadn't yet come out. So the really interesting thing about my education is I was doing design for like books and posters and information. And then when the iPhone came out, it changed the landscape of every designer, right? We all were like designing in this little box. And it was with that shift that I realized how incredibly important it is and how much bias goes into how people engage with technology, or how much bias even goes into the services that we experience every day. And I gave an example of Snapchat, for example, like how the team didn't have people with dark skin on it. And if they had, the face filters would have worked for people with dark skin in the first 3 years of launching that app. And so as I started to observe a lot of these inequities and a lot of this kind of way in which I always say to my students, like, designers, we build the world around us. We build the apps people use. We build the spaces people go into. We are the ones that design like the interface in the car that you use, you know, and you think about the importance of cognition and understanding the experience. Like if you don't design that well, like people's lives are at risk, right? And so there's so much power that's given to this role of the folks that are designing the world around us. And yet we never sign a Hippocratic oath. We never sign anything that like says that we have to do more good than harm. And in fact, I think you can probably squint and see a lot of organizations that have a long path to go in that world. And so with that continued journey and kind of learning where some of the pitfalls were in my own industry, that was when I realized I wanted to shift my focus to really thinking about people who are least represented in my industry, or least represented and learning skills like I learned, you know, and my students, like at California College of the Arts, they go through the program and are almost certainly going to be getting these like tech jobs out of that program. But there's not a lot of access to this knowledge and this information for kids who, kids of color. Like there's, you know, there's a very low percentage of Black and Latinx kids who are able to even kind of get connected to this learning these skills or learning creative problem solving, because it's not really seen as something like, with the way we structure our schools, we don't do a good job of creating an inclusive space for a broader range of kids. And so that just became kind of my mission, is like, now that I know this set of skills, I would much rather evangelize and build that capacity in others than go hide in a glass office and build apps forever. And so that's kind of where the intersection of my work came from. And, you know, I'm not perfect, right? I'm just trying to make this path for myself in hopes of making like a small shift in the way our industry works. But I have a journey I'm on a journey as well. So let's like be clear on that too.
You talked about access to information and inclusion, and that brings up another one of my kind of passion areas, which is the use of language as a way to both include people and a way to kind of unintentionally exclude people. I mean, I'm not just talking about inclusive language and person first language, but actual vocabulary levels and reading levels. One of the things that I do at least once a year is I teach trauma-informed parenting classes with some people at the county to birth parents and foster parents. And we spend a lot of time specifically taking the resources. There's some national organizations that have amazing resources for that, but knowing the birth parents that I already have relationships with, and knowing that many of them, because of past traumas or because of a variety of issues, never even completed school, and I know that they're not able to access that text. And I've seen that same level of access, you know, when you look at forms that are required to be completed for, you know, accessing services or even finding information about increasing your skills online. Can you talk a little bit about language and inclusion, if you've got thoughts?
Sure. Well, you're talking to someone with a inherent bias. Myself, I tend to be much more of a visual learner. I always have been in my own learning. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier, which was about just an example, like for example, when you're driving a car and somebody is designing the interface, or when even you're in a passenger in the car, or anything to do with something that requires being able to quickly respond and react to the experience of, time sensitivity, basically. That's a microcosm, for example, where if we're not able to take the needs of the person trying to create an action, I mean, all design really is taking someone has a need and whatever the interface or the experience is solving for that need. Like, it's pretty simple, right? And so with sort of the lens that I'm trying to bring to the table is meeting people where they are and looking at modalities that can actually help support a clear understanding and people getting to achieving that action as quickly as possible. And so when we look at things like the census, or when we look at things like voting, or when we look at all of these different really important parts that are generally forms with a lot of writing on it and not that easy for people to understand, especially if English is your second language or you didn't grow up able to kind of become fully literate by the time you're 18 for whatever reason. I actually think that we sort of owe it as people designing those things, right? I'm not the one that designs ballots, but there is somebody who's doing that work, to ask ourselves, what are other modalities that folks can be learning? An example of a project that I worked on about 4 or 5 years ago was with a great organization called Beyond 12. And their focus was with first generation college students. And they had a really wonderful arsenal of resources and tips for their students to help them succeed in those first 2 years of college, which is where we see the highest dropout. And one of the challenges that they were realizing was that they weren't really designed for students. They were more designed for the person facilitating the exercise to have all of their resources in one place. And so what we did is we actually had, we hired a bunch of Snapchat stars to basically explain how to fill out your FAFSA, or the importance of registering for classes on time, or all of these different topics. And so in that case, again, it might seem a little kind of flippant or kind of goofy, but it actually really helped with comprehension, and it really helped with these young people who were already feeling really inundated with a lot of information in a short period of time, be able to engage with that content, and realizing that something like the FAFSA can actually just be free money. It's not like some extra tax form you have to fill out. I mean, it is to some extent, but it's 10 minutes of your time, and here's how you do it, and get a parent, and da da da. And so that's something I think we should all be asking is what are other ways that we can be thinking about bringing this to life? And sometimes it takes getting a little creative, but if the end game is that young people are able to sort of thrive, as opposed to not, let's be creative in how we solve some of those problems. So I don't know if that helps answer that question.
Yeah, no, I really like the idea of thinking about not just, what are we collecting information for at the end, and how is it convenient for me as the person collecting that information, but thinking about how is it convenient for that person to provide that or look at that or learn about that. And I think it also speaks a lot to, the use of emojis and TikTok and Snapchat and, even GIFs, and I pronounce it as GIFs. I don't know if that's going to start a fight with anybody.
I do as well.
But using that visual language, it's an ongoing argument between my father and I, so. But just that use of visual language and that accessibility, we have it out there for, recreational apps and for communication, and translating that into the public space and into the space of the work of inclusion every day, I think is important for all of us to think about.
Yeah. One other example, sorry, this just popped into my head as well, that comes to mind is I've shared this case study, I believe, on Wednesday. It all blends together, but it was with a program with youth and young adults who were just recently incarcerated and leaving custody and needing to effectively kind of learn what their rights are so that they can have power within a system that's often kind of stacked against them. And the design work that myself and the team I was with did there was that, you know, they left custody, we got like a stack of papers, like really like a large stack of like, here's everything you need to know. Here's when you need to meet with your parole officer. Here's if you get arrested again, here's what will happen, right? It was just like a lot of information. And I think that one of the key challenges that we observed was like, it was overwhelming, not just to re-enter society, but also to have all of these rules attached to your existence. And if you don't meet with your parole officer, you go back in jail, which the stakes are very high, or jail or custody, depending if it was temporary. But when we looked at how we might redesign that experience, we were also inspired by the stories that like the young men that I was working with at the time told. And I shared this story before, but like, you know, saying like, you know, I want this to feel like putting on a fresh suit. And taking that as inspiration for our design, we realized we have to make this feel like it's written with and for this community. It's not like this huge stack of papers that's almost impossible to make sense of. And that there's support kind of embedded all along the way. And so designing, again, these programs with other young people who had been out of custody for a year or two to help kind of share and disseminate that information. So another thing that I find really important when anything to do with kind of reading or literacy comes into play is making sure that there's someone or some program wrapped around comprehension and actually person to person. Sadly, COVID, it makes it a bit more challenging, but can be one of the most, I think, effective and meaningful ways to help think about that as well. So just wanted to highlight like another example where we were looking at literacy and trying to figure out other ways to bring that experience to life.
Yeah, I really like that. I kind of think of that as like a terms and conditions trap where a lot of social services agencies, there's just so many, you know, pieces of paperwork that have to be done and have to be given out. And it seems all very standard and normal, but there are these little tiny things embedded in there, you know, in a permanency plan for a parent who has a child who's been taken into care. It might seem like here's 16 pages of legal nonsense, but on page 14 in paragraph 2, it says if you don't call this person by this day, you're going to have to wait another 6 months before you have a chance at getting visitation right back. And you know, kind of having that passive notification and making ourselves look at that and find ways to change that into are we really making sure that we're providing that ability to comprehend and that opportunity to discuss the important piece in there. You know, just like when you look at your receipt from the store and you say like, okay, the important thing to know here is I have 30 days to return. There's 27 extra pages on my Walgreens receipt, but down there at the bottom is this is the one that's going to get me if I don't do it right. Hard.
Yeah. And what I try to explain to folks, and I think there's another woman I want to point folks to as well in this space. Her name is Antoinette Carroll, and she gives us a beautiful TED talk about how systems of inequity are designed and therefore can be redesigned. And it's really at the heart of, I think, what so many of us that practice this social impact design believe. I think I show this again to all my students and say, like, you know, this is 5 minutes summary of, I think, why we do what we do. And so even to your example about these long social contracts, those were designed by someone, and often like various forms of oppression have whether intentionally or unintentionally been designed, and they can actively be restructured, but we have to model what that looks like. And we have to also, you know, find the right stakeholders and think about ways that we can start to chip away at redesigning oppression, which is no small feat, but someone at some point designed that infrastructure and that framework. And so therefore it can be redesigned. And yeah, I think it's a really powerful message. And yeah, again, to learn more about sort of that lens, I highly recommend folks check out the work of Antoinette Carroll and her group called Creative Reaction Lab, which was actually developed in result of a lot of the Ferguson riots many years ago, obviously now, but continues to do some really incredible work around this topic.
That's awesome. Thank you. I'm just peeking over at Jess to see. I know I saw her start to look like she had something she wanted to say a couple times.
Lots to say, but I will add that I did post Antoinette Carroll's TED Talk into the chat roll for folks. So thank you for calling our attention to her, Minnie.
Great. I'm glad you found it so fast. Excellent.
So Jess, I just wanted to check, were there any other questions that seemed to come up from anybody else? I mean, I feel like I could continue picking your brain and like maybe just start talking specifically about, you know, redesigning my son's IEP and starting some new paperwork. I think fighting the paperwork battle is something of a passion project for me because I'm stubborn. I don't like to see frustrating things, and you know, it happens a lot, and it seems to happen the most to people who are in need of assistance, who are in need of some sort of social service involvement. But I really appreciate your time and your ability to just talk through those things on the fly and your passion for all of this.
Well, likewise, it's been such a joy and pleasure to be a part of this conference and conversation. And, you know, I think it's a little bit of a cliche, but we all have a role to play. And I encourage folks who, you know, are kind of thinking, how can I, you know, I'm not an expert, or I don't have a background in casework, or I'm just starting to kind of build my muscle around, you know, creating a more inclusive workplace or education system, to really, you know, find small ways to start, you know, find a way that you can change the way you frame a question with your students, for example, that might be more inclusive, or might be maybe instead, you know, you're thinking, how can I set up the slideshow or whatever I'm putting in front of people to have simpler language, or to be more visual, or to be more just being conscious. Adding in definitions is something we so rarely do as well. I find that one of the most common things is young people will be like, well, what does that mean? You know, and we can all just do the smallest things to start to chip away at this work. You all are experts, obviously, but anyone else kind of watching, I think to just know that every single one of us has a role to play, and every single one of us has something really valuable to bring to the table. And I think it's just about being humble and embracing a growth mindset, and that we're all learning together, and elevating the voices of folks who historically have not had a voice. I mean, that's really my job, is to do that. And if I'm setting myself up and the groups I'm working with up to do that, then like that's all I can ask for at the end of the day. So thank you guys for setting this wonderful event up. I'm so glad to be a part of it.
Awesome. Thank you too.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us this week, Minnie. I do feel empowered. Not that I am your target audience in need of empowerment, but I really do love the design framework that you bring, that is not a way that I am typically looking at the world. And I do feel optimism and hope that there's folks like you out there, and that with these tools we can consider how to design systems and programs with a different power structure in mind, and with that power sharing, and for the benefit of those using or being served, as opposed to those of us administering them, and sort of that weighing that power of what's the true desired outcome. Is it control and power and mitigating risk, or is it human empowerment? So I just really value the time that you've taken with us in these lessons, and I'm sure our audience, both live and those watching later, will have many takeaways. So thank you again, especially for folks that don't know, Minnie is out on the West Coast, so it's always a little earlier for her. So a Friday morning, we feel extra blessed that you were willing to wake up for for Wisconsin. So thank you, Minnie, for that as well. We have about 45 minutes before the breakout sessions will begin. Dr. Elizabeth Wasson and Dr. Crowley will be in the main breakout room, which is this room. And then William Tipper Thomas III's social drop-in breakout will be in the second breakout room. So scroll a little further down on your browser and watch for information in the chat and on the slides for your breakout room information. So with that, enjoy your break time. Thank you, Minnie. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you. See you soon.